I'm here at Woodstock Town Hall where people have been listening to the podcast based on their town all day, S-Town. And its producers say it starts out as the investigation into an alleged murder that supposedly happened right here in town.
So let's just start with this podcast is wildly popular. More than 16 million people have listened to it. How does that make you feel?
It's nerve-wracking for sure.
Why?
It's caused a lot of stress in my life, and my life's been pretty stressful as it is, and hadn't really helped much. Sometimes I regret ever speaking into that microphone because I was probably upset or wasn't thinking clearly.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is the second installment of our discussion about S-Town from This American Life. So in the first installment, we talked a lot about how S-Town came about and how Brian Reed was contacted over and over again by John McLemore. In this installment, we're going to get underneath the surface and explore more about the behavior that we see exhibited by John and in this town. So now we'll get back into the discussion.
And about him being gay. This was in an area, I believe, that didn't accept the Constitution and that same-sex relationships, people could get married. I think Alabama was one of the only states that went against that.
Well, they certainly were trying. They were doing as much as they can. They still are. But it's definitely, in terms of progression and progressive political thought, Alabama is one of the trailing states in the United States of America. Right. That's for sure.
It seemed like in this little town, it probably was an open secret that he was gay, and that's something like they could accept it in him as long as it wasn't out.
Well, hang on, who's they? Because remember, this circle was relatively closed in terms of people that knew.
Yeah, I mean,
and
everybody
I think
at
Brian was quite interested in, the fact that he started to have the view that he possibly was gay. He didn't know who else might have known that. I think, he didn't really say anything to people outwardly, and he let people say it back to him. But that kind of journey of discovery, it wasn't one that was on the surface as such, although I think he said some odd things like, everyone thinks I'm a queer here and sucking your dick, was the expression that he would say.
Well, yeah, but he made it that way. In other words, he couldn't do it in a very, in a polite way or in a
modest way.
Yeah, he had to make it an extreme. And I think that's how he lived his life. Everything was to the extreme. But I do think that he did want to help Tyler and probably wanted to help Michael, but because he was falling in love with them. And to me, that's very manipulative. That if you're taking somebody who's straight and who has a family, and when their girlfriends come by, you treat them badly, or when their kids come by, you are very disrespectful to them because you want to have access to this guy alone, that's not friendship. That's not being a mentor. That's not helping him in any way. I think he was taking advantage in a number of situations that we hear about in this podcast.
Well, it's actually called control, isn't it? And I think control features very heavily in this. And, you're right. In terms of every relationship that Brian finds that's kind of a significant relationship, they all say the same thing about him, which is he desperately wanted that one-on-one. There was a female that he did some work with at the council, because originally he was on the inside doing things and then got expelled and rejected. So became more and more extreme and, outside the system, if you will. But even she said that, he didn't like the fact that she was then getting married, and he kind of rejected the relationship every time someone's attention was focused elsewhere. He just couldn't bear it, which tells me a little bit about his, sense of entitlement and narcissism, that he's got this ego that needs to be at the center of things.
Why do I feel so sorry? Why do I feel so sorry for him, you guys? I hear what you're saying, but I just feel my heart breaks for him, that he's just, I don't know why. Maybe it's because I've heard if I'd never heard his voice before, or had an image of him, maybe I could be like, yes, he's horrible. But I just feel like
Well, he's pathetic.
This lonely guy, a fish out of
deserving
water in
pity,
his own pot.
But
Yeah.
at the same time, what kind of person was he? Why do you feel that way about him if you actually drill down and see the kind of person he was? Was he actually taking care of his mother? Like he held it out to the community that he was? Or was he actually making her worse? Apparently, since he died, she's been so much more alert and
Going
functioning.
out and socializing rather than isolated, locked in a room, him not, basically interacting with her. He would take her maybe pizza back, and we got this flavor of him being this caring character. I can't speak at the moment. I'm looking after my mother. He wasn't looking after his mother. This is somebody who was abusive, who was neglectful, who let this woman just languish in this house.
Not just languish. Didn't he board up the windows? She wasn't getting any sun. He was locking her in so that he didn't have to take care of her, so he didn't have to make sure that she was okay. I mean, to me, that's holding somebody a prisoner.
It's abuse of a vulnerable adult. We would call this previously elder abuse in the UK. It is a criminal offence. Now it's, abuse of a vulnerable adult, and that's what she was. But since she's been with Rita and Charlie, as you said, she's been going out. Her dementia has, gone the other way, which I've never heard of that happening, incidentally. But all those things were exacerbating her condition. And why? Because it suited him, that he could then have time to do the mad genius things in his workshop or go to church, in inverted commas.
Yeah, church. Well,
which was really what he was about. And the more he did that, the more that he needed it. So it's not just the abuse of his mother, but what about his attitudes to women? And that wasn't a secret, in terms of what people said about him, of how he characterized women, that he hated them. He was a woman hater and a misogynist, and he called them whores.
he was proud of it.
I didn't feel any sympathy hearing those things, that the story, the S-Town excuse and almost want people to be sympathetic towards him because they are not understanding what truly is going on here. I felt that he was a terrible human being. He may well have looked after the dogs. I mean, who knows? But I would imagine they weren't in a particularly great condition. But this is a terrible human being who exploits younger, vulnerable people and older because he is about him and him alone. All of this was about him.
The world revolved
around him and his sheer brilliance.
If not the universe.
His arrogance and narcissism. I'm afraid I didn't hear too many positive traits or characteristics. This was the John McLemore show, and it was an incredibly selfish thing that he did. That suicide is a selfish act.
Yeah,
and the fact that
absolutely.
he sowed these seeds to people, that he was leaving them money, and he didn't leave a will. He let everybody fight it out. And I think this was part of his intention, that he wanted to create this controversy and have people infighting and get Tyler's attention, and almost as a punishment to
Make
Tyler.
him feel bad, right.
Make him feel bad because he wasn't lavishing the attention on him anymore.
Right, because John had him pierce his nipples that very night that he ended up killing himself. And he wanted him to come back and do more. And he's like, no, I'm with my family. And I need to be with my family. But it was the selfishness of it. I didn't see it as desperation because it was so planned out. It was so thought out in advance. And maybe the reason why he killed himself was because Tyler was more present with his girlfriend than with John. But maybe it was because he had spent all his money. Maybe it's because he didn't have anything left and he was a fraud. He was living a fraud and he knew it was all coming crashing down. But what was really interesting to me was that when Michael came into the picture and started talking to Brian about John, that he said that, John did help him, right? So I do believe, like some other famous people, let's say entertainers who profess to love children, did help them, but also had a sexual fixation on John. Didn't seem to be a pedophile, but John seemed to have a sexual fixation on young, straight, young adults, males. And
the unobtainable, who he'd give safe harbor to.
Yeah.
And on the basis it looks like he's mentoring them and looking out for them. But it's reciprocal. He's getting what he wants, which is their attention.
Right. Not only their attention, I believe that literally he wanted the physical contact with these guys. And when Michael said, I think something might have happened with Tyler, like he stopped coming around or got a girlfriend. I mean, so Michael didn't know anything about the situation, but that's exactly what happened.
It's so telling him. Why would he think that in particular?
Because Michael's experience was the same. And when John met Michael's girlfriends, he treated them badly. And he did not want him to share his life. When that's not what a mentor should be doing. A mentor should
or
be
a
getting
friend.
Yeah, should be getting somebody to a point where they can stand on their own 2 feet and accomplish something in their life and have a wonderful life. Not lock them in and control them, as you said, Laura. To me, this was very, very, this was the darkest of what John did. I think he controlled his mother. I think he shut her in. I think he controlled other people. And he used this lure of this money, and you might get this, to keep people around.
And he brought Brian in to tell his story, really, whether he had suicide in mind, you know, and it was that thought out. But I think the timing is important here. And Father's Day with Tyler and that finality element of him feeling that he's losing Tyler more and more, you know, the attention is going back to the girlfriend who's pregnant, and he wouldn't come round and do the piercings and, you know, and he was into all this flagellation and, you know, and the pain element that is linked to the sexual aspect, a paraphilia. And we discussed paraphilias in one of our latest pods. But I think a lot of this was set up. And I think, unfortunately, S-Town has fallen short in being able to really to describe the racism, the abuse, and the negative characteristics of him. And it's been dressed up as something very different so that people do feel sympathy. And for me, that's where they fall very short in terms of truly understanding who he is, what he was doing, what he was motivated by. But he got what he wanted in the end, which was everybody talking about John McLemore.
Right. Hello, it's Jim Clemente and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
Oh, yeah, I have this on file at all times in case it's necessary. You never know.
Your suicide note?
We weren't going to call it out loud, but you did.
Well, we're looking at it. It's right here.
I keep it on file. Yeah, well, we didn't have a camera. Big mouth.
He doesn't linger on the suicide note long enough for me to read it. He claims he doesn't want to talk about it.
You shouldn't have said that. Fuck it.
I think that we have a situation here where somebody who is very articulate and intelligent and adept at manipulated Brian Reed into getting his story out there and making him a household name, which is basically what he lived for.
Absolutely. You Google him and you'll see so many articles on who is John McLemore, which is exactly what he wanted. And you said right at the start, which I didn't know, how many times did he try and contact Brian? You know, this kind of fixated and obsessive mindset that you could describe as brilliance and, you know, amazing and genius. But actually there's very dark depths to his character, for sure.
I completely respect everything you're saying, and I hear everything you're saying. You know, my heart, I heard such pain in this person that it got to me, just as not in a clinical way that you guys are looking at it, but it really got to me. It reminded me of a friend of mine who killed himself, and he threatened it all the time, and it was always like threatening it to get people to come over to take care of him. And then, one day he got into a fight with his wife and she wasn't having it. And, she left to go get them something to eat and he did it. And for me, it was just like this massive fuck you to her, which is incredibly selfish. But of course, he paid the price for that. He paid
the price.
She paid the price, but he did. But hang on, yeah. But also, the worst thing that I would say about John B. is killing himself live on the phone with another person. I mean, no matter how much pain you're in, you're putting them in this horribly traumatic position, and that really I thought was horrible. But again,
it's horrific.
But how about the fact that his mother was left penniless and
penniless?
Yeah. She had nobody to take care of her. She
Not
had nothing.
penniless. I mean,
yeah, sure she was. She didn't have any money.
Well, that was the whole point. Is they wanted her estate and all that land and everything.
There was no estate. Well, the land is basically worthless. I mean, the tree guy, the lumber guy, took it over. But when you actually look at,
but leaving her alone,
his so-called
definitely.
carer leaving her alone.
Of course, yeah.
And that part again was incredibly sad. And so I agree with you. There are aspects where, of course, you are taken in and you do feel sad, or you connect to a situation of, a friend trying to kill themselves. But suicide is a very selfish act, and it's the people that are left behind that have to pick up the pieces. And I mean, I still don't know who this Faye was in relation. Do you know what I mean? Why was she the one that he called?
Yeah.
It made no sense really, other than for me, it was a thought out plan to give her directives and directions of what to do, but to expose her to that, incredibly traumatic for her.
Question: what do you make of him taking cyanide in order to kill himself? What do you make of somebody who does that in order to end their life? It's
very painful.
Yeah.
I don't know why he chose that, other than the fact that he was a chemist and he may have a lot of this behavior may have been as a result of mercury poisoning, as it turns out, because he was literally playing with fire when he used mercury. Mercury is very poisonous, and you should not be breathing in the vapors of it. But it can cause people to become depressed. It can cause you to become psychotic, and it can kill you. It's actually a poison. So that's possible. But I think it's a very dramatic way to go out. Unfortunately, I think everything about him was dramatic, overly dramatic, and this is just one way to do it. But what was really interesting to me is when Brian, at the end, did a little genealogy study on the McLemore family, and it turns out that Jesse Miller was a notorious gangster from that area. He was a murderer, and he had a gang that basically murdered people left and right, and they were notorious for anybody who tried to cut them off or not do what they say, he would murder them. And he had a son named Brooks Miller, who bought 124 acres in Bibb County, and Brooks Miller had a daughter named Mary Grace who inherited it, and Mary Grace was John McLemore's mother, and that's the property that John built the maze on and the house was on, and he grew up there. It's just interesting that he had this lineage. And I know, we've talked about James Fallon and the psychopath gene and so forth, and
Right.
James found out that he has the same genes as his great aunt, I believe, Lizzie Borden.
Yeah.
But James tries to use his psychopathy in a good way. In other words, he's not using it to take advantage of people, but he believes he is a psychologically definable psychopath. And I think John McLemore may also be. And it would make sense given his lineage here. It's sad. It's a mystery whether or not he had any money left. But what isn't a mystery is that he certainly did not take care of his mother after his death. He did not take care of any of the people that, like Tyler, who he said he loved
Would
and all
look
that.
after and look out for.
He basically screwed them and created a lot of problems in this town, and pretty much wiped his family off the map there. So spending all that time, effort, and energy and on the maze and on these clocks and on all the things that he was working on and all the research he was doing, but not giving a damn about how his mother was left. That, to me, was the coup de grace in terms of, I'm sorry for the listeners who like John, and I'm sorry, Lisa, that, you were taken in by him. You said you were.
I'm not taken in by him. It's just I feel how I feel about him as a human being who is not, who had whatever problems. I don't know what you would diagnose. I guess you've already said, but
I think he's a psychopath.
He has some psychopathic traits that we
he
can
has
certainly hear.
mental disorder, bipolar disorder. That's clear. But when I said taken in, I believe he manipulated you. He manipulated you through Brian. He manipulated Brian. And because of that, now everybody knows his name. And, I'm sorry that people were taken in by him, because I do believe he was a bad person to the last minute of his life. And just how he killed himself, and the fact that he did it without taking care of the people he said he cared about, but more as a fuck you to them, to Tyler in particular, because Tyler would not come back. I think that's why he did it. And just calling the county clerk, maybe it's just a phone that he knew somebody had to answer. And so he wanted to make a record. Right.
At the time that he chose to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, there aren't too many, redeeming things about him, sadly. And it's not to say bad people are bad all of the time, but, listening to what we were exposed to, he certainly, had very few redeeming characteristics and was incredibly manipulative. There was possibly manic depression there too. But some things that he could have seen someone and could have been treated for, but he didn't want to do that. He saw others as inferior to him and his, smarts. And, I really do feel the way that he treated his mother was very neglectful and controlling and isolating, and he didn't do the things that he said that he would. So his actions and words are completely incongruent at best.
But I will say that in the end, his suicide note it ended with this, and I quote, "I would hope that all persons reading this can enjoy some of the aspects of life that I enjoyed, as well as those aspects that I never will, and will take cognizance of the number of waking days he has remaining and use them prudently. To all that have given so much love and respect, John B. McLemore." So he articulated in his suicide note a very benevolent wish for people who hear about him. I wish he had actually done that in practice, because I think he hurt people with his suicide, and I think he did it deliberately.
When Tyler cleared out all that paperwork from John's house in the days right after he died, he did find something else that was curious. It's a list John wrote on a sheet of yellow notebook paper, titled at the top, "People to Contact." Tyler sent me a photo of it, and Faye Gamble, the town clerk, told me that John sent a copy to her as part of his instructions before he drank cyanide. There are 15 names and phone numbers on the list. Tyler's name is not one of them.
But, we did hear some very interesting testimonies from people like Owen and some of the men that were in his life, and how that relationship came to pass, on a almost like the equivalent of Grindr. But Owen sort of making it clear that, yes, he was incredibly smart, but he was full of profanity, and, on a personal level, there were certain things that he just couldn't get by. And so the relationship sort of withered on the vine, which is, again, his inability to be able to connect and not have his narcissism kind of take over and put himself as number one, his inability to connect with people and hold a relationship in a, I don't say normal, because there's no such thing as normal. Right. But, for Owen, who seemed very smart and intelligent himself.
So sweet.
Yeah, he seemed like a very, intelligent and sweet man. And the whole account around Brokeback Mountain, I think, was very moving. But how dismissive John McLemore was, even though he hadn't seen the movie, hadn't read the book, but he was just adamant in his own view of it without even having any knowledge of it.
And him, I did feel sorry for, because I thought that was a missed opportunity, and that was something that could have been true love, but it never happened. And it never happened probably because John was pursuing young men who were easily manipulated
as well.
But unobtainable. Yes, that were vulnerable and unobtainable. And it's just something that, somebody with that much brilliance should have been able to figure out a way.
He kept repeating the same pattern over and over again, didn't he? And expecting to get a different outcome.
Absolutely. And that was the thing. Before Michael came into the picture and started explaining what history and what his pattern was, I had recognized this as something that it looked like, it was very dark, because in the guise of helping, he's actually trying to manipulate somebody into a very controlled relationship.
And that pseudo-caring, for me, was the hallmarks of coercive control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly
absolutely
what characterizes him and his relationships. And if he can't control it, he'll force it to another level.
Yeah. And if you want to see an example of that, watch A Good Husband, episode of Criminal Minds that I wrote last season. Because
Episode 12 of season 12?
Yes. And it was exactly the same kind of situation. Well, almost exactly.
Well, there's certainly clear hallmarks there, and that was John McLemore in most of the relationships that we heard about anyway. And there may be others that, of course, we didn't hear about. So I'd definitely be interested in hearing more about that if our listeners know of any further insight around him. But that's our particular view. In fact, Jim and I listened to it independently. We didn't listen to it together, and these are the conclusions that we came to independently. And it's only now that we're discussing them, so it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I was really surprised to hear that.
The profile is fairly similar.
But that's the whole point of going deeper than just the surface and actually looking at the behavior. What does the behavior tell us? And his behavior spoke volumes. And his words spoke volumes, but his behavior told a totally different story. And it was disturbing in the beginning, and it only got worse to me when all the layers were peeled back by Brian. I think it just revealed sort of a rotten core, and it's a shame because I did want to like him. I was pulling for him when I thought, oh, this is a guy who's gay, and he's in a state and a county and a town that doesn't accept him, so he has to live undercover. But then when you actually look at what he's living like, and I didn't feel sorry for him anymore. I felt bad for the people around him that he ended up hurting.
And I'd agree. I mean, it's the concentric circles around him. It's not just one thing. And that's, we're looking at it multidimensional. It's not just one thing that he's said or he's done. And the final, reveal that he, will flagellate, whip himself so that the welt, and then he'll want Tyler to do it more and more, and the piercing on top of piercings and all those things that are very sexualized behavior, this pain relief, as he called it. It was all about a sexual high and creating a form of intimacy with Tyler, and this secret, of going to church and having this intimate, it's dark when you understand, his mindset and his relationships with people. Sad and dark.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your perspective, guys. I appreciate it. I have to say that even though I've said that I, enjoyed this character, I actually didn't really enjoy the podcast that much, the series that much. I mean, I'm a huge fan of This American Life, and I've listened to it for decades. And I mean, this was very well done, but I mean, I've had so many episodes of This American Life that actually stopped me in my tracks and stopped my car and had me pull over to listen to. And this probably wasn't one of those. If it hadn't been, kind of popped out to the media, I wouldn't really have noticed it any more than any of their other pieces. But everybody certainly seems to be captivated by it. So,
well, everyone jumped in because obviously on the back of Serial, everyone was desperate to hear something similar again. I mean, I don't know what your view of it was, Jim. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, I liked it because it was so rich behaviorally. It disturbed me. I ended up being pissed off at John, obviously, in the end. I felt for Tyler and Michael and Olin, and I thought they were all sort of in different ways victims of John's. And even Brian, because I feel like he cared about this guy, and I think John used him and his relationship to get what he wanted. He accomplished that, and then just bagged out of the situation. And again, like you said, Laura, it's what he did to his mother, how he was really treating her, what was really going on, as opposed to how he presented it to the world. It's just a shame. He could have been. He was a great character in the beginning, and I loved that. But it just really disturbed me as I got deeper and deeper into it.
I had alarm bells ringing the whole way through, and I guess when you get exposed to things, you always want to see the other side. You want to see that actually, no, that, this is an insight that you're seeing, but you're going to see some things that are very different. But I just had alarm bells ringing from start to end. And there were parts of me that just wondered whether, S-Time were trying to make something out of nothing with this whole story. You know, I certainly have a strong view, my own personal and professional, about putting people like him on platforms when so many people have been exposed to a negative side to him, to abuse, to coercion, to exploitation. And I don't think he deserves this platform and these 10 million downloads, putting his life out there.
I'm sure it's vastly more than 10 million downloads now. That was 4 days in, they had 10 million downloads. So I think, you know, this is going around the world, and I hope people listen to what we have to say about this guy, because by holding this guy up, putting him on a pedestal, I believe that they're absolutely helping this kind of, you know, misogynistic, self-interested, narcissistic behavior. I wouldn't want to see people promoting that.
And the coercion that so many people miss, you know, it's subtle. And that's the thing. Coercive control and manipulation, it can be very subtle. And, you know, as Jim and I know, it's not always overt. It can be. But what you're seeing isn't actually really what's going on, you know, of the truism of it. And so it can be hard for people to see. And it is a challenge when it's not seen and identified and challenged by people, you know, and therefore we get this, oh, well, they're a genius, ergo we just ignore some of the other things that they're not so great at. They have a few interpersonal problems. But actually, this is somebody who went unchallenged throughout his whole life course. So, you know, and even right to the end, you know, all these people that have been taken in by him. And then, you know, as Jim said, you know, to me, he takes the coward's way out right at the end because he's not getting what he wants, you know, to be satisfied by Tyler. And whatever those last conversations were about, well, only Tyler and he knows. But obviously he was trying to get Tyler back to the house, and they weren't talking. So it must have been something pretty significant where he sees finality to whatever degree.
Right.
And, you know, he executes his careful plan that he's got this cyanide and he's on the phone to somebody whilst he's doing it, the final hurrah. And then this, you know, suicide note that sounds like he's, you know, reflective and, you know, putting something back. To me, that's just cosmetic and window dressing of him trying to secure a legacy of his name in lights, which he said one day his name would be in lights. Well, that's what he got through S-Town.
Yeah. So we'd be interested in finding out what you think. How you respond to our insights behaviorally. Yes, it's dark. What our opinion is of John and what he was doing is dark, but it's based on our experience working cases that involve people like this. And yeah, I'm just glad, really glad that he didn't turn his violent streak on his mother as well. But the damage that he did to her life and all those years that he sort of had her locked up in that room.
You're right. It could have been a homicide-suicide very easily.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, you guys.
Yeah, so,
on that note.
Yeah.
It's controversial, but there are views as they stand of reviewing this independently and objectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to Real Crime Profile.
So if you enjoy our podcast and would like to support us, there are a couple of important things you can do. First, you can go over to iTunes and give us a positive 5-star review. You can check out our sponsors and take advantage of the special promotions for Real Crime Profile listeners. You can go over and like our Facebook page, and you can follow us on Twitter. But most importantly, you can share our podcast with friends, family, and anyone you know would be interested in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes. So thank you for listening.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineered by Terrell Parham. Music composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clemente. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline, free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, safety, shelter or counselling, call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, 214-946-4357, or go on their website, www.genesisshelter.org, or the Domestic Violence Hotline on 800-799-7233.